Everybody wave to the camera. So dear Thai, dear Sangha, so welcome to our third session of dialogue between monastics and scientific researchers. So here in Plum Village, we're just these past few moments experiencing a downpour. And it's very lovely. We had to close all the windows and we feel cozy here inside in the meditation hall. And Thai always invited us to practice listening to the rain meditation. So I don't know if all of you there online, you can hear the rain on the roof, but maybe you have rain there where you are. Maybe it's sunny. Maybe it's morning, maybe it's evening. But we'll start with 3 sounds of the bell and just practice listening to the rain meditation. So, dear respected Thai, dear brothers, dear sisters, so I'd like to introduce to you the presentation for this evening. So it's a dialogue that I had with a philosopher, so we could call it the monk and the philosopher. So last week I sat with, I met on Zoom with Sebastjan Vörös from Ljubljana University. He's a philosopher of epistemology, phenomenology, as well as a Buddhist scholar and a practitioner. So he's someone who's really gone through a period of suffering in his life and used the practice of meditation and mindfulness to transform his suffering. And so there are actually 2 parts to the dialogue, and we will watch a kind of edited version which combines aspects of the 2 parts. But hopefully tonight we will put both parts on the website so that if you want to hear the whole conversation, you can follow it. The same is true of Elena Antonova last night, and I think most of the one we'll listen to tomorrow night with Dr. Ian McGilchrist. So we'll put these extended versions online, but we've edited the conversation down to about an hour today. And I really enjoyed this talk, so I hope you can enjoy it. Just even if there are some terms and things you don't understand or names you don't know, it's fine. Just enjoy breathing and allow the conversation to unfold, and see how our understanding of knowledge and of science actually affects the way that we do research, the way that we look into our mind. That is the topic of the discussion. So I hope you enjoy it, and then of course after the presentation, it's about an hour, we'll have a chance. Sebastian is very kind. He's offered to be here with us tonight and answer questions. So don't hesitate if you have a question during the presentation. Write it in the chat box, and if you write your question in the chat box, that means that you're happy to come on the video screen and ask the question in front of everyone. So yeah, and please pay attention if you've asked a question to the chat box. Sometimes we had trouble getting a response from people to queue you up for asking a question. Okay, so sit back and enjoy your breathing and enjoy this wonderful dialogue with myself, Liam, and Sebastjan Vörös from Ljubljana University. Welcome to our session. This is we're sitting with Sebastjan Vörös of Ljubljana University in Slovenia. And Liam, maybe we'll start with the sound of the bell, so we can all come back to our breath, come back to our body. Just enjoy this present moment. It's great to be hanging out like this and just looking deeply into our mind together and coming to hopefully a deeper understanding together. So we'll start with just 3 sounds of the bell to appreciate this present moment and especially our breathing. So dear friends, I'm Brother Phap Luu, and I'm the monk in this monk-scientist dialogue. And I'll pass it over now to Liam to introduce our guest today, Sebastian.
Ljubljana University, an expert in phenomenology, philosophy of science, philosophy of cognitive science specifically, epistemology, and also something of a Buddhist scholar on top of that. So very well placed to sort of translate between the Buddhist method of understanding our mind and the scientific understanding of mind. And so we decided to have him here to answer some questions about how we can interface between the teachings of the Dhamma and what science is discovering.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure and an honor, really.
Great, and thank you for coming. I think Phap Luu, I think maybe one thing that we like to just ask people is just like, well, what how they got here, sort of your journey to where you are now, and specifically your interest in the Buddhist methods of understanding the mind. How you acquired an interest in that, and how they inform the rest of your work in a broad sense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, actually, it's quite a complicated story, as it usually is, I assume. It was basically a very, very personal story in a certain sense, because it was related to my trying to somehow come to terms with certain, let's say, academic interests that I had, with certain, let's say, existential longings, existential seekings that I was undergoing. And at a certain point in my life, I came across the work of Francisco Varela, and he somehow managed to provide a framework in which I thought I could combine some of the things that were becoming more and more relevant and interesting and important to me. I had this sense, this feeling of some sort of a discrepancy in my life, where I became more and more interested in contemplative traditions, especially because of some of the, let's say, personal struggles I was going through, with, as I already mentioned, some of the more academic approaches that I was also pursuing, and that I found relevant. And there seemed to be a pretty big gap between these two broad areas of interest, of research. And Varela's work somehow helped me to combine these two dimensions. And this happened, approximately 15 years ago. And it kind of opened up a whole new avenue for exploration, investigation, research, thinking. And I'm very grateful in a way that I was able to find this precious gem. And that's also why I'm very grateful to be able to work on the book, on the life and work of Francisco Varela at the moment.
I guess, Phap Luu, we discussed earlier perhaps the idea of having Sebastian take us into a short overview of developments in cognitive science and philosophy, especially as they relate to the tradition, and and what we'll be teaching on what's been taught so far in the course. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
I think maybe if I can just preface it by saying that so we're here on this retreat. We're every day practicing mindful breathing, mindful walking, coming back to our body, and looking into what's coming up in our mind. Especially with the topics of the talks this week have been about understanding our mind in the sense of a kind of garden. So we have these seeds in our consciousness that like we use the metaphor of a garden to talk about our anger, our fear, as well as our mindfulness, our understanding, insight. And depending on where we put our attention, we are like a gardener watering those seeds in our consciousness and inviting them to come up and manifest in our mind consciousness. So that it's kind of like the present moment awareness of what is in our mind. And so that is a path of cultivation. And I think that it's very helpful for many of our friends who are not familiar with maybe developments in the philosophy of science, especially around neuroscience and understanding the brain, understanding the mind, to see how this practice of cultivating the mind is actually validated in a way, yeah, by by science and by a way of looking at the mind, especially the practice of non-duality, of seeing the subject and object arise together, like we talked about earlier. So I think if you can help us to see how those things relate to developments in science, in cognitive science and so forth, it would be nourishing for our practice.
Yeah, well, first thing that I would like to point out is, as you probably know, cognitive science is basically a very diverse field. So there are a lot of different approaches in that field, as is usually the case with almost every discipline, every field of inquiry. But there are, of course, certain, let's say, dominant fields, dominant areas, and one of the more, if not the most prominent field in cognitive science at the moment is, of course, neuroscience. From the beginning of the 1990s, when these different imaging techniques appeared, which allowed us to, in a certain sense, study the happenings in the mind, neuroscience came more to the forefront, and this idea of brain being the central actor in everything that is related to mind, cognition, consciousness is now almost, it seems like, commonsensical knowledge. But I would like to perhaps point out that there, in the past 20 or 30 years, also different approaches to cognition and mind have appeared. For example, the classical approach was usually depicted the cognitive apparatus, the cognizer, the subject or the person doing the cognizing, the thinking, as some sort of digital, as a very complex digital computer who created representations of the external world in his or her cognitive system. So basically, you would get inputs from the outside world. There was this idea that there existed a pre-existing, predetermined outside world, which somehow impacted the cognizer and then triggered the appearance of these representations, which were more or less accurate. And then based on these representations, the actors acted in the world. So that was, in a very simplified way, the classical paradigm, the classical approach that was predominant and is in certain areas still is. But in, let's say, past several decades, several alternative approaches emerged which question some of these presuppositions on which the classical approach was built. And here I would perhaps like to emphasize two such two points that seem especially relevant for our debate. The first point is that the cognizer, so the organism doing the cognizing proved to be a lot more active in the very act of cognition. So the cognizer is not merely someone who builds representations of the external world, but basically, in a certain sense, helps to co-create or co-constitute the world he or she lives in. And this is related to the, let's say, the very organization of the cognizer, of the subject doing the cognizing, doing the thinking, the various ways he or she can interact with the world. And these modes of behavior, these modes of action, and the very organization, the structure of the organism proved to be very, very important in determining what the world looks like for the cognizer. Not merely in the sense of, how the cognizer distorts the external reality, but what basically reality in a certain sense is for that particular organism. And of course, this raises several interesting questions, especially if you take into account the scientists themselves are also organisms that are interacting with the world when they're trying to study other organisms. And of course, then this raises the question, so what is the nature of knowledge provided by the science and so on and so forth? So that's one thing. And the second related point, and then I'll pass on the word to you. And the second, and I think this is also a very related point, is that although this might sound strange to someone outside the scientific community or outside the academia, but scientists became more interested in studying and investigating lived experience again. Now this, as I said, might sound strange, but the thing is that from, let's say, 1960s to 1990s, the idea of studying experience directly seemed strange, bordering on preposterous. So the idea was that you should study consciousness or mind more broadly indirectly, so via certain either behavioral patterns or certain cognitive mechanisms that you can somehow study from the external perspective, but not by actually going into the experience itself. And in the past 20, 30 years, it became more and more prevalent, more and more obvious that this is perhaps, you know, slightly naive, that if we want to understand the structure and dynamic of consciousness, we should in fact go and investigate consciousness itself. And this has brought several very interesting happenings, namely, for example, cognitive scientists became more interested in, on the one hand, certain philosophical traditions that were deemed to be obsolete or obscurantist, such as, for example, the phenomenological tradition, the tradition which always emphasized the importance of lived experience and going into the lived experience. And on the other hand, also contemplative traditions became all of a sudden more interesting, because they seem to be they seem to provide these practical know-hows in the forms of various elaborate, rigorous contemplative techniques that would enable that could enable one to study lived experience directly. So that, in a nutshell, I would say, are some of the happenings, some of the more recent movements in cognitive science that I think are particularly relevant for this debate.
Mm. That makes me feel very happy to hear that there's that movement, because it means that as meditators, we actually create a space of communication with scientists where we normally feel like there's this huge gap, right? That we are meditators and what we're doing is a spiritual thing, and you know, scientists are studying material, the properties of matter in an objective way, and you know, these two fields, there's no place for them to meet somehow. And so hearing that like you yourself and many of the scientists that we've been talking with in the retreat are actually returning to this validity of experience is really that I think that brings me a lot of happiness because it means that, you know, it brings it back to the human level. I think that's sometimes as you know, here I'm a monastic, but I was going to say as a lay person, it means I'm not a scientist in that sense. You know, you read about what experts say, and you know, people who have lots of degrees and experience, and of course everyone's experience is valid, but there's always that danger, and this happened in the Buddhist tradition too in the past, where we become specialists in our religious or our scientific or whatever we call it endeavor, to such extent that we can't not even explain to somebody else what we see and what we understand, and that's caused a lot of suffering with the kind of elitist attitude in the past. And so something we always emphasize in our retreats is like your experience is valid, and the litmus test of a good practice is that it brings you happiness and freedom in the moment of doing it. It's not something like you just have to endure for years and years and then in the hopes of getting some kind of awakening in the future, but that awakening is here and now. So that it seems like there's a congruence there going on between science and meditator. And maybe that's because more scientists are meditating.
Maybe so, maybe so.
But I wanna focus on this first point a bit, because our teacher Tai often talked about the cinematographic nature of consciousness, and he would use sometimes the example of if you have a candle and you move it around very quickly, then it creates the impression of a circle. And so even though each of those points is just one point, one candle, but the impression is a circle, to help us understand how our brain creates a sense of continuity in instance of consciousness, and that in each instance of consciousness we are actually like a painter or a film director who is actually both directing and experiencing the product of his direction, right? So you're both creating the film and you're a participant in it. So again, that's another way of talking about subject and object arising at the same time. If you remove in a sense, the so-called subject, the director, then you also remove the film, the object. And so when we talked earlier, you shared a little bit about some Merleau-Ponty,
yeah.
Sorry, Ponty, and how some of the exercises that he proposed for us to help to understand this, what is phenomenology, what is the study of our own experience, how can we go about understanding the way we perceive things and how that affects the way we live in the world. So I don't know if you want to go in, you'd like to share more about that.
Definitely. Let me first preface this by saying, that this is precisely something that has been proposed by some of these alternative currents or approaches within cognitive science. Maybe we should give them a name so that people know what we're talking about, so that we label it. Usually they go by the name of enactive or embodied cognitive science, precisely for the reason because they emphasize this importance of action and embodiment in the constitution of the cognitive world we live in. So the idea there is precisely what you've so beautifully sketched. So this ongoing dialogue or dialectic between the world and the subject. So they, in a certain sense, co-constitute or co-determine one another, as Francisco Varela and his colleagues Evan Thompson and Eleanor Roche put it in the famous book, The Embodied Mind. Yes, but what you refer to, so Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he's probably one of the most, if not the most well-known French philosophers. And actually this approach that I sketched ever so briefly was inspired by Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology originally. So Varela, Thompson, and Roche explicitly say that what they're trying to do, they're trying to, in a certain sense, elaborate on some of the ideas that Merleau-Ponty presented in his phenomenological work. And what Merleau-Ponty was trying to do basically is he was following the phenomenological tradition started by Edmund Husserl, and he tried to find a way to get us back into the lived experience. So to move away from certain theoretical presuppositions and theoretical preconceptions that we have about experience and go into the lived experience itself. And his basic claim or basic idea was that if you go into the realm of lived experience, and he called it phenomenal field for the reason that I will explain later on, you basically end up in the domain which is inherently non-dual. So the lived logic of experience is non-dual. which does not make it irrational. That was Merleau-Ponty's point. So you could talk about it intelligently, but of course you have to approach it differently. Okay, and yeah, the example that that I presented yesterday was a very simple example. It's basically the most basic example taken from the Gestalt psychology, which was one of the traditions that Merleau-Ponty was inspired by. Namely, if you focus on something in your visual field, it can be whatever. You can just focus on any object that is in front of you and look at it. Now, if you do that and you remain in your experience, so you remain in your experience, what you will notice is that as soon as something is given to you as a figure, so as something that is given to you clear in such a way that you can see it clearly, so that you can determine its properties, characteristics, you can describe it clearly, yeah? The rest of the visual field needs to move back into the background. So you have a dual structure. You have a ground and you have a figure. And the thing is that figure is given to you explicitly. By explicitly, I mean that it is given to you clearly. You can describe it in a clear. You can enlist and enumerate all the characteristics of the figure that you see. But at the same time, the rest of the visual field moves into the background. And the interesting thing is that the background also has a specific structure. It also has specific characteristics, but it's not structured in the same way as the figure is. Whereas figure is given to you in a determinate way, so determinately, the background, the ground, is given to you indeterminately. So it is not nothing, but at the same time, it is not determinate. It has a specific texture, okay? And the thing is, the main point that Merleau-Ponty was trying to make is that
right.
as long...
Sebastian, could I just for the benefit of everyone, maybe could you clarify what you mean by determinate and indeterminate?
Okay, what I mean by determinate and indeterminate is precisely this, that if something is determinate, you can basically characterize it clearly. You can determine the properties of that entity clearly. So, you know, a figure is determinate in the sense that it is given to you explicitly, which means that you can describe it clearly, okay? Whereas the background, the ground, is given to you in an indeterminate way, which means that it is given to you implicitly, which means that it is not nothing, but at the same time, you cannot really specify its characteristics. Okay. Now, the important thing is that as long as you stick into, so as long as you remain in the experience, whenever you try to shift the figure from one figure to something else, the background will shift as well. So the main point here is that you have a dual act always happening. There is no figure without a ground and no ground without a figure. And one way of thinking about this, and I took this from a British physicist turned phenomenologist, Henry Bortoft, who said that in the lived experience, what you have is you have a relation that he calls differencing relating. So in order for you to have a figure, in order for you to have a figure standing out from the ground, there has to be a difference. But at the same time, for a figure to be a figure and a ground to be a ground, you have to have both aspects. So there has to be a relation. So there is this dynamic logics of differencing relating that is inherent to the lived experience. But there's another element, and this is where I'll end this little description or narrative. Namely, what is given to you, what is given as a figure or ground is determined by the attitude, the attitude taken by the observer. So the observer, the bodily attitude, the bodily orientation towards the visual field will determine what will be given as a figure and what will be given as a ground. And now here comes the nice twist. Namely, the ground will provide possible anchors for further movements of that behavior. So the observer, in a certain sense, structures the visual field, but then the visual field beckons or calls forth further actions from the observer. And by doing so, it changes the observer. In a sense, it gives birth to a specific nature of the observer, or a specific identity of the observer. So the observer brings forth the visual field, and the visual field in turn brings forth a specific self of the observer, and so on and so forth. So there is this inherent, implicit co-determination of the subject and the object. And that's the reason why Merleau-Ponty uses the term phenomenal field. Because in this field, whenever one part changes, the rest of the field has to restructure itself in such a way as to maintain the organization of the field. So it is an interwoven unity, so to speak. And I find this idea extremely fascinating. So as long as you stick in the lived, in the realm of the lived experience, you're basically you find yourself in the domain of the non-dual, so to speak. Was that too abstract, or?
No, I think so. You know, our teacher had a practice that he proposed about 12 or 13 years ago. So it was a poem that he came up with when he was in Korea, and he was leading a walking meditation, and there were many camera people. He's kind of like a rock star in Korea, and he could not even make one step, and he thought, how am I going to do walking meditation with all these cameras in front of me? And so he said, I cannot do it. I'm just going to let the Buddha do it. And so he came up with a poem which is let the Buddha breathe, let the Buddha walk. I don't need to breathe, I don't need to walk. And then it continues, there is only breathing, there is only walking, there is no breather, there is no walker. And Buddha is breathing, Buddha is walking. There is no breather, there is no walker. And I think that's very much in the spirit of what you're sharing, which is that when you have the figure and the ground having this relationship with the viewer, we think we're a self outside of the situation. And we're just viewing an objective experience. But what Merleau-Ponty is saying, that we're actually, the self is determined by the observation. So the very act of observing is creating, and that is another way of expressing non-self.
Yeah, and interbeing as well. I mean, you inter-are with your environment, right?
Yeah. That's a very good point, and I think that so this emphasis on movement, on action, is really important. Yesterday we talked about one of the biggest problems that Merleau-Ponty identifies in our coming back to the lived experience, and that is what he calls the predominance or the prevalence of objective thought. And what he means by that is that we already have a certain preconception about what the reality is really like, so that there exists an external world which consists of objects that are, in a certain sense, these mathematical, geometrical objects that exist each on its own, and they are causally interrelated. And when you basically try to get back to the experience, what you do, you try to project this image into the experience itself, instead of trying to figure out how this image arises within the experience. So how objectivity gets constituted in the dynamic flux of the experience. So there is
There's a kind of grasping going on, like you want to appropriate the image and make it your own, so you can take it with you everywhere you go.
Precisely. That's actually a really good way of thinking about it, because Merleau-Ponty says that it is in the nature of human perception to kind of ends up in objects. So whenever your visual field kind of gravitates towards objects in it. Yeah, but these objects, as I've said, are basically co-determined with everything else within your experience. But it takes a specific stance, a specific reflective stance. We could call it also a mindful stance, to observe this, to see how all the segments of your phenomenal field are basically interrelated. When you're in your everyday dukkha state of mind, you're basically moving in the realm of objects, and you basically, in a certain you are moving in a world that seems to be pre-structured, predetermined, so without any contribution on your part. But taking this reflective stance shows you how basically the world you live in and you yourself, so who you are actually much more closely intertwined than you can fathom or grasp in your everyday activities, particularly when engaging in conceptual thought. Okay.
Yeah, so I was just reminded of one thing Tai trained us in is to take each step in mindfulness, and that when we walk mindfully on the earth, we actually transform the entire experience. So the way he expressed it was, you make it a legendary moment. And I think what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that when we transform the way we look at something, so we're no longer grasping at it as something we're going to appropriate, but rather just move through the world, for example, with mindfulness. So it means we're not grasping onto anything. We're letting go of our, even of trying to hold on to the experience itself. Then we're actually kind of entering a flow of relationship between subject and object arising simultaneously, and what we are experiencing inside of ourselves is just in a sort of perpetual relationship with what is around us, what is the formations that are coming up within us, whatever is the object of our attention. And which is another way to express seeing this moment as a legendary moment. It's something that is a phenomenon, a wonder that is manifesting through our body and mind in a lived experience in the present moment. But as long as we continue to just think and grasp onto, this kind of limited conversation or whatever, then we're only just we're moving through the world, but we're not recognizing or honoring this intimate experience of relationship between subject and object that is arising in every moment.
That's actually that's actually a very nice way of phrasing some of the things that we've been just talking about. What came to my mind at this moment is that I think that one of the problems, perhaps, in for example, when scientists and, let's say, Buddhist practitioners, or for that matter, phenomenologists, start talking about consciousness, is that they use the same term, but they don't really mean the same things. And even my saying that was problematic, because I said they don't mean the same things. So you see, the reification, the objectification of everything is so deeply rooted in us that already the way we speak, kind of predisposes us to doing exactly that. So to try to understand everything through the lens of the notion or the idea of object in one way or another. But what I mean by what I've said, so the fact that scientists and Buddhist practitioners sometimes talk past one another, is that usually how consciousness is understood by in contemporary scientific climate, it's something that is subjective, something that is relegated to the realm of the skull. So it's here, you know, and we don't. So some of the scientists will be completely dismissive of it, and they will say there's no such thing as consciousness. Basically, consciousness is just, you know, a neurophysiological process. Some who are willing to admit that there is such a thing as consciousness will probably revert to something as, well, consciousness is an emergent property, whatever that means. So it's something that cannot be reduced to the brain, but it's somehow emergent. But the main problem here is that, from what I understand of Zen Buddhism, for example, or Mahayana Buddhism in general, is that the notion of consciousness, or of mind for that matter, is basically way broader. It's not something that is, you know, conceived in the same way as it was from Descartes onward, because this is basically a very Cartesian, very Cartesian image. That you know, you have this mechanical world, again consisting of objects that you can study and determine their properties, and they are causally interrelated, and everything else that doesn't fit into that picture is basically subjective, which means it has something to do with consciousness, and consciousness is somewhere in the mind, in the realm of the human skull. Now that's a very strange way of thinking about it. Yeah, it's you know, if you start thinking about the relationship between the world and the mind or consciousness in such a way, it's very difficult to see how you will be able to conceptually bridge this gap. So one of the things that I think phenomenology might contribute to this debate is that it opens up our understanding of consciousness. So what consciousness is. And one way of doing this, for example, is that, you know, in this example where we that I mentioned earlier, or depicted earlier, where we had a figure against the ground, usually we think of consciousness only as this segment that is like a beam of light that focuses on something, but we disregard the background, what is given implicitly. So this indeterminate part, the implicit aspects of consciousness. Usually, you know, we have either something is conscious or it's unconscious. Well, phenomenology say it's way more complicated than that. The realm of consciousness is way broader than that. There are implicit, indeterminate segments of our conscious life. And I think that this is something that could be brought into the dialogue with some of the conceptions of consciousness and mind in the Buddhist tradition a lot more productively, I would say. And I think that this type of reform, or even perhaps revolution in our understanding of what consciousness means, is necessary in order for us to be able to take this dialogue and this exchange forward.
Yeah,
You know, I think
go ahead,
sorry,
Ian.
I think at that point it's good to just really briefly reflect on a few, you know, developments, just to put this in a broader perspective, right? Just thinking about Skinner, which people would have heard before, that at some point there is this idea in psychology of behaviorism, because you can observe behaviors, and so the psychology just focused on explaining behaviors, like what rats did after you kind of stimulated them one way versus another, because you can't, then you don't have to look inside the mind at all, right? If you want to sort of look, if science, everybody has to look at the same stimulus and then talk about the same stimulus, so they can have an experiment where they are attending to the same thing and then discussing the same thing. They have to focus on behavior rather than just looking inside their minds and sharing about that, right? And that whole episode in history where we were trying to understand the mind just purely by behavior, people will remember, and shows you like where we've come from. That was only 70 years ago.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Marvin Minsky, I think, there's a famous vision scientist, Donald Hoffman, who shares the story that Marvin Minsky, who was an early artificial intelligence researcher, gave vision to one of his students as a summer project. Essentially, he thought that they could describe all human vision just in a summer project. And like 70 years later, we're still working on it. And the reason why that it comes about is because if you come from the view of the world just being there as we're taught to think, not you creating the world as we've been talking about, then it seems so obvious, right? The whole role of us in creating what's in front of us was outside of the perspective of science. So science is kind of reliving the whole process that we relive in the practice of realizing, oh, I'm creating all of this, right? It seemed reasonable to them to think that they were going to understand the mind and the summer vision of the summer project, because they're looking at in front of them and saying this, oh, this is just here, the same way that we look at our surroundings is just here, and then have to question, is it really just here, or are we kind of putting it there, through a very elaborate unconscious process of directing the movie. And so it's interesting to watch science having that same perspective. And one last thing is I think that one element of the practice that people will miss is having a lot of interactions with other people, because this is one of the ways we can see how we're creating things very strongly in a day-to-day experience. Because oftentimes we think someone hates us, or they have this or that motivation. We have a very clear experience of the inner life that has a feeling and the intentions of another person. And then they say something and we realize, oh, I just made that up completely. It was totally real to me, but then I made it up. And we get that experience really strongly in the practice and in community and Dhamma sharing as well. So if people, reflect on their interactions with their family, we realize oftentimes how much we're creating everything. And so I think that's a powerful process of transformation, is just looking at your personal relationship.
Yeah, and if we could just bridge, I think that's a perfect segue into what I was thinking. We could bring all of what we've been learning here about the ground and the figure and the evolution of cognitive science and the differencing and relating exactly to that point, which is to the suffering, the experience of suffering, and how we are creating suffering in our mind. So we're seeing from a different direction, from phenomenology, from cognitive science, from behaviorism into the present, how we've been evolving and understanding the way in which our consciousness is creating, perhaps we could say in an implicit way, our experience of the world that we feel like we're just seeing. And so we experience anger, frustration, sadness because of something that is created in our own mind, right? We see something visually, or we hear somebody say something, and we are hurt by what they say, and then we create whole stories around why they said that, and that story is kind of bubbling up inside of us. And in the Buddhist tradition, it's called prapancha. It's kind of like this whole mix of like bubbling up of thoughts and concepts and notions, the stories that we create inside ourselves in order to, we're trying to become free of that suffering, that hurt. But in a way, usually we're only nourishing it even more, creating more suffering by that story, because of course that story oftentimes then diverges from the lived experience. And so maybe, Sebastian, if you could talk a little bit about that, because that's where we get to the duality and how that we get this divergence between things as they are, and things as we think them to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there are several aspects that I could point out here or follow here. One of the things that I think is interesting is this this idea that basically, for example, Varela, Thompson, and Roche borrowed from the Buddhist tradition, and when they talk about the groundlessness of life. So once you enter into this realm or domain of the phenomenal domain, where you have this ongoing dialogue or dialectic between the subject and the object, there is basically no more solid footing underneath your epistemic feet, so to speak. Because what happens is that this idea, this Cartesian idea, or perhaps it's even way older than that. So this idea of being a self-enclosed something with the world that is existing outside of you being also a self-enclosed something kind of falls apart. And this is something that can be very frightening. And this is basically something that whenever you go deep enough, realize is the texture of reality in any meaningful sense of the term of reality. That is to say, there is no self-enclosed me, because I'm always in a certain sense projected into the world, and there is no self-enclosed world, because in a certain sense, world always, to a lesser or greater degree, reflects me. And you know, so I'm never like fully self-enclosed, but kind of through my actions I become who I am at a certain moment, and open up new possibilities in the world I live in, and these possibilities call forth other actions which, you know, change me, even if ever so slightly. And once through, particularly, let's say, mindfulness practice, you come to the realm or domain where there's no footing. This I think is extremely, this can be a very frightening experience, and I think that this is an experience that many meditators do actually experience. So usually when we talk about meditation, we focus on the positive aspects, on the positive feelings, and this is definitely something that enters one's life after, if one cultivates meditative practice for a prolonged period of time. But there are also periods of profound distress, especially when you're faced with this groundlessness. And the thing is, this groundlessness is always present. So even in people who are mindless, it is present. It is, and we have names for it. We like, you know, existential angst. But what is existential angst, right? It's basically staring into the abyss of this ongoing dialectic of life, basically. And I think that one of the biggest things that contemplative traditions in general, and Buddhism in particular, can give us is ways to enter into this realm open-hearted, to embrace this groundlessness, and to kind of work with it. As strange and paradoxical as this might sound, but I think that I personally think that this is where suffering at its most profound level kind of enters the picture. Not everyday suffering, you know, I would like to have like a new car, or why can't I have more money, or whatever. That's like everyday regular suffering, or why am I not a perfect meditator, things of that nature. But like this, the origin of suffering, the root of suffering, the mother of all the minute sufferings that we encounter in our everyday lives, I would say comes from this. And this is why you have in various traditions this idea of philosophy, religion, contemplative practice being a a way of cultivating, I don't know, your relationship with life and death, with the very texture of life and death. Anyway, these are just some of my thoughts on the topic.
That's great. And you know, I think what can help a lot of the friends who are here with us in the retreat, experiencing peace, joy, and happiness from their meditation practice, from the practice of mindfulness, is understanding how this is also a scientific experiment. That when the very act of meditating is a radical act of looking into ourselves, and we are doing research while we're doing it. There's a certain validity to this experience. I find that very empowering, and I often share about it when I teach the Dhamma. I say, look at yourself as a scientist. You know, don't export your sovereignty to knowledge of yourself, of your own experiences. So if we could just, you know, just maybe to bring this all full circle, we started out talking about experience, and now we've gone through, you know, non-duality, looking into ways of perceiving the world, and then how we can embrace suffering. So going, you know, maybe to bring this sharing a little bit to a close, although there's never a close to anything. Yeah, I know you, amongst many other interests that you had, you translated the William James's Varieties of Religious Experience into Slovenian. And so in very much the spirit of that book, which transformed and actually built a modern sense of psychology in the West, it was a coming back to the validity of experience, of how each of our experiences is valid. And so even the slightest suffering, or the deepest, as you say, existential angst, is something that you can't say it's right or wrong, right? So it's beyond notions of right or wrong. This is real experience. And so maybe how you respond to that, or how can you help bring us forward in this retreat?
I would say that it is definitely refreshing that these questions are becoming again more prominent in, let's say, academic community. This was precisely one of the things that was started by the phenomenological tradition, you know, trying to look into the experience and find different ways, different forms or ways of validity. So what constitutes validity within a given experience? And of course, this opens up a whole plethora of questions about, you know, what is knowledge, what is valid knowledge, what is justified knowledge, and so on and so forth. So what is evidence, for example? I think that there's a lot of work to be done in this domain, and I think that these types of dialogues are extremely useful and precious in this regard. And I think that one other thing that I would like to maybe point out here is that when these dialogues between, let's say, science and contemplative traditions happen, it is well known and that sometimes these dialogues can turn into implicit monologues. We talked about this. What I mean by that is that, you know, scientists do have this tendency to listen to what the other person is saying and then somehow translating it into scientific terms. So, for example, you go and study meditators, and then, you know, you get some brain scan images, and then you have a valid account as to what is really going on. Now, one thing I would like to say here is that, for the most part, from my experience, most scientists do not do this from some sort of epistemic arrogance. So it's not like that they necessarily think that, you know, well, our modes of knowledge are better than yours, and we will simply run them over. But it's just it's just something that is related to scientific education, to scientific to becoming a scientist. It's just that for the most part, scientists do not really reflect on the fact that they too somehow stem from specific background, from specific framework, and that this framework has certain criteria of validity. And within this framework, you can do a lot of interesting and marvelous things, but it still needs to be examined as to, how does this framework fit into the broader sphere of human existence in general. So what I want to say by this is that these encounters, although they sometimes can move in the direction of monologue, are, I would say, in the long run beneficial. Why? Because it is usually when we encounter forms of life, in quotes, yeah, that are different from ours, that we actually become aware of certain presuppositions that we take for granted, but we don't really have the ability to perceive in our everyday lives. Because when we are embedded in our everyday lives, everything runs smoothly, so you don't really see that you cherish certain presuppositions. It's like a fish swimming in the sea. Yeah, as long as it's in the sea, it does not know what the water is. It's only when you take it outside of water that it realizes, oh gosh, right? What was that marvelous thing that I had and I took for granted? So what I'm trying to say is that these confrontations actually are really nice opportunities for us to reflect on these presuppositions that we have, and, well, basically to first of all become aware of them, and then try to understand them and see where the other person is coming from. And this is where the dialogue can really start. So when you start talking on this meta level, on this second level, where you can basically start comparing different understandings of what it means to know something. What are the valid criteria for knowledge? What is the evidence, and what gets constituted? Let me finish off with one small comment. Usually people tend to get nervous when scientists are too loose with the term of proving something. So science has proved that this is the case, and so on and so forth. And this can be somewhat unnerving. But I think that this is actually, in itself, it's not that problematic. I think that, this is not the core problem in these types of debates. Let me try to explain why. If we agree on the rules of a certain game, say chess, yeah? Once we agree on the rules, then we can also agree on what it means to play a certain game well. So what a good move would be in the context of the chess. But that's only once you all
to touch this groundlessness within ourselves. Notice all the frameworks of our mind, our ways of the games of chess, the rules of chess that are always there in our daily functioning, and we don't recognize them and see. We don't need to prove anything. Just enjoy the sound of the bell and come back to our breathing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure. I didn't get any signal. If I can hear. Hello. Can everybody hear us online? Okay. Okay, great. So I just, I'm sorry that we had some difficulty editing, getting the edited file for the interview. So just to sum up what Sebastian was sharing at the end there. So he's talking about how when we agree on rules, for example, the game of chess, then we know by those rules what a good move is. And so he's drawing the comparison to science. So we can talk about proving something in science because we have a certain set of rules that we all agree to abide by. And when we make a discovery and we're able to prove it using the rules that we've all accepted, the rules of knowledge, then we can say that is proven. And so that is why it's not a problem to say it's proven, but we understand that that's within a framework that we all accept. So I just want to add that little bit because he got cut off and it flipped to me in the bell. So, what I've heard is that unfortunately Sebastian is not there. He's not online. And so I guess we will, I don't know, is there any news from the back room? Have you contacted Liam or contacted Sebastian? Sorry? Okay, so maybe if we take a moment, we can just breathe in and out and have a short meditation, and then maybe if we're lucky, Sebastian will have the right link to get on Zoom. So maybe we can listen to a sound of the bell. We can just let all of these words, all of the deep looking, just sink into the mind and go into store consciousness. We don't need to evaluate them, to judge anything. It's just a process of deep looking. As we listen to the sound of the bell, we can come back to our breathing, come back to our body. Breathing in, I know I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know I'm breathing out. In, out. Breathing in, I follow with all my attention the whole length of my in-breath. Breathing out, I follow with all my attention the whole length of my out-breath. Following the in-breath, following the out-breath. Okay, great. Hello, Sebastian. Can you hear?
Definitely, definitely. First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for listening to my talk. For me personally, it's always difficult to listen to myself speak. I'm always surprised by the broken Slavic English I'm able to produce. Well, thank you for bearing with me.
So, dear friends, so we have the first question from Lina.
Hello, dear Thai, dear Sangha. This is a question for Sebastian. I would like to know if you could please go back and specify the difference between the notion of consciousness used by Buddhism and by phenomenology. And also, can you explain with an example how phenomenology opens up the concept of consciousness that you consider will be useful for Buddhist conception? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure whether I would be able to draw a very accurate comparisons between the Buddhist notion of consciousness and phenomenological notion of consciousness. So maybe some of the brothers could help me out here. But I can definitely say a few words on the phenomenological notion of consciousness with some confidence. So the basic idea or the basic contribution of phenomenology to the notion of consciousness is, in my opinion, this broadening of the concept. So in addition to merely understanding consciousness as containing the explicit aspect. So for example, when I mentioned that example of figure against the ground, so focusing only, for example, on objects that are given to us in consciousness in clear and determinate way. The phenomenological notion of consciousness also includes implicit aspects. So, for example, the ground has a different structure, and although it's not explicitly given, it has a specific meaning for me and is part of my conscious experience. And for example, authors like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was mentioned in the talk on several occasions, actually provide several examples where, for example, specific segments in our experience are given to us, although we are not necessarily explicitly focused on it. So these segments are part of our awareness. They have a specific meaning for us, although we are not necessarily focused on them, and we don't see them as, let's say, objects with determinate features. So for example, I might be doing something, and while I'm doing it, I might be able to grab a cup or something, even though I'm not explicitly aware of it. Now, you can do this almost semi-automatically, or you can eventually train yourself to be able to somehow become more grounded in this process, so that you become more aware of the overall structure of your phenomenal field. And this notion of consciousness that is not related strictly to the mental, to the cognitive, to something that focuses explicitly and specifically on objects, but also entails or encompasses, for example, certain corporeal aspects. So our modes of embodiment, our potential manners and ways of behavior. This is something that I feel is a valuable contribution of phenomenology to the idea of consciousness. So, and this, if I may just add, is also related to this notion of phenomenal field that I was talking about. So this phenomenal field where you have the part of the subjectivity is played not only by a cognitive segment of our being, but the whole being, which entails, again, corporeal aspects. And it is this whole, let's say, organismal structure that is in interrelationship with the life world, with the world of experience, the world of experienced meaning. So that's basically my answer.
So dear friends, we have now a next question from Elaine.
Thank you for the conversation today. I deeply appreciate it. What came to me while you were talking is I was traumatized 54 years ago when I was 19 years old through a very serious illness. I was totally paralyzed. And I'm wondering, I have to be in the room with people, with other people to be able to meditate. I found Thai 19 years ago, but I have to be in the room with other people. I can't, it's really challenging for me still after 19 years to meditate by myself. And so I'm wondering how yours, if you have done any studies with people that have been traumatized and how it might affect someone later in life, how it might benefit someone, or if this is strictly something I would have to talk to the monastics about. I'm not sure. So I'd appreciate your input. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you for the question. I can perhaps share a few thoughts on that. One of the things is that if we take seriously the notion of consciousness being encompassing these corporeal elements, then the phenomena such as trauma and similar events gain a somewhat different meaning. For example, there's a very interesting there's a very interesting example in Phenomenology of Perception by Merleau-Ponty, where he talks about the phenomenon of regression, repression. I'm sorry, and basically what he says is that many people think that when you repress something, you simply it's usually construed as a very cognitive act. So you have a certain something that's unpleasant. For example, there's a certain trauma that happens. There's a failed relationship. There are very specific structures or patterns that are present, that are toxic and are present in one's parental situation. And these somehow then get submerged in subconscious, and it's construed in a very, very intellectual way. But Merleau-Ponty basically says that when this happens, what happens is that you, in a certain sense, incorporate that specific self that is present in that traumatic event. And the problem is that this particular self is wedded to a specific experiential world, so a specific world of meaning. And even if you cognitively think that you have somehow transcended it, that you have moved past that event, you're basically keep on reliving it. So this difference between, let's say, the cognitive, the mental aspects, the thinking mind, if you like, and the larger mind that keeps repeating the same pattern, keeps repeating the same self and living the same world or creating the same world, is something that persists. And from this perspective, in order for one to be, in a certain sense, saved or cured from this particular issue, involves again the whole being. So the usually the whole existence has to change somewhat. And I think that contemplative meditative practice that basically involves the whole body is very, very suitable in that regard, not to mention the whole Buddhist framework of dealing with suffering. But this is precisely it. I think that spiritual traditions such as Buddhism have many different and very multi-layered ways of dealing with complex issues of this type. So it's really hard to be I mean, it's hard for me to give specific and concrete advice, given that I don't really know what the specific problem or issue is. But I would say that cultivating the practice seriously and persistently is probably a good way to somehow break out of these specific patterns that we usually get caught up in. Because again, mental analysis is just one part of the whole puzzle and of looking for the right solution. But it only takes you so far, and after that, it is finding ways to basically restructure yourself in such a way as to let go of the world that you live in. So this could be, of course, also translated in Buddhist terms, but maybe I'll leave it at that at this point.
So the next question we have is from Yvette.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Good evening, dear Thai, dear Sangha. Thank you so much for this presentation. Sebastian, I found it really enriching. I have a question about the relationship between language and consciousness, and whether in your study and in your field, rather what your field has to say about this relationship between language and consciousness. And I just asked this out of pure curiosity from speaking different languages and knowing people who speak different languages and literally realizing that our perceptions are different because of the words we use. And I wonder if you have any comments on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very interesting question. Now that this is, mind you, this is a very, very, very thorny question in the field of philosophy and especially field of philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. So whether the language that we talk basically determines the world we live in. So whether people who talk, who speak different languages in a certain sense think and see things differently. So it's an interesting question and definitely doesn't have the final answer. But one thing that I would say is that dealing with the question of the relationship between language and experience shows us to what degree you basically can and do change the meaningful contents of the world you live in through the linguistic means. So by living in a specific linguistic community, you are in a certain way living in a somewhat different world. Now, this world is not predetermined, it's not fully determined, so language will not completely separate you from other aspects of experience and so on and so forth, but in a certain sense, it lays down a certain framework which you find normal, and which seems to you as an basically as your everyday normality, but it can turn out that once you either start learning a very different language from the one that you speak, or you come in touch with someone who comes from a very different linguistic and cultural background, you see that there is this interesting, there are these interesting differences between your patterns and modes of thinking. Basically, sometimes we could even say that in the worlds that you live in. What is important here is, I think that instead of focusing, for example, on specific things that a given language opens up in our world. So in a certain sense, what is more important is understanding this process, or seeing this process, seeing how language is one of the tools that basically shapes us, structure our world. So this constructive, dynamic force or influence that is present in the language, and not taking the concepts and the things we live in for granted. So this is precisely one of the problems that I mentioned during our discussion, namely starting already from the things, the objects, the concepts, the notions that your world is populated with. Instead of that, you have to, in a certain sense, step back and see the process of how these things in which we live get constituted. And then we realize that, that basically, for example, a phenomenon like language plays a very, very important role in what we take for granted. And we take it for granted simply because we were, in a certain sense, thrown in a specific linguistic tradition, in a specific cultural milieu. And this, again, opens up this feeling or the sense of wonder, the sense of astonishment at the fact that things could be different, and that they can be different, and that there is this constructive, constitutive element that is present in our lives, and that some of the things that seem to be predetermined, that are fixed, are basically not. And given the fact that so that language is also strongly related with how we understand ourselves. So it is very, very strongly and intimately related to the narratives we usually implicitly or explicitly adopt about who we are, and what we are like, and what our role is in the world or in society. We also see that these things too are, in a certain sense, malleable, so they can be changed, they can be modified. So it's a very interesting and very important question that basically shows, again, this very, very dynamic inherent structure of consciousness, and language being one of the ways in which we act. In a certain sense, it is an extension of gesture. So it has a very similar structure than the gesture, and the gesture is an embodied movement, and it opens up certain segments of meaning in our world. And we do something similar with language, but with a lot more plasticity and a lot more nuance. So that, in brief, or not, yeah, it wasn't really that brief of an answer, but yeah, those are my thoughts on the question.
So we have now a last question from Michaela. I cannot highlight. Oh.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hello, everybody. And thank you that I got a little bit surprised that I was going to to make my question to Sebastian. You can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's I just read it as I was writing it, but maybe I am not writing it in the right way. I don't know. It's a little bit maybe confusing, but you can tell me if it is. But my question was, if we create the world that we live, like you were saying that in a way we that's what we see and what we live is what we create. Could we say that even if we all see the same objects, or something that we can relate to, that we don't see the same things, even though they look the same? Does that mean we all live in a different realm or reality, like we were walking on the same street but seeing a different street at the same time? And do we meet each other just in the same real and reality when we share the same experience? Like when do we really meet and see the same reality? And then the next is, can developing compassion, where we can understand more deeply the reality of the other or the other one, can that become a way to enter in each other's realm or reality, and in that way broaden our own realm and reality? So excuse me if it is too much and maybe confusing. You can tell me.
No, it's definitely not confusing, and it's also, again, it's a very interesting question. So thank you for posing it. First off, I would just like to emphasize that I wouldn't go as far as to say that we basically construct our worlds. It's this is a very, very strong position that I wouldn't endorse wholeheartedly, because obviously we are not gods or semi-gods that have the ability to simply construct our experiential reality at will. But what we can realize is that the world and ourselves are at a very deep level strongly interrelated, so strongly interconnected, and that there is this dynamic interaction going on between ourselves in the plural and the worlds we live in. So that would be the first point. The second point would be whether we live in different realities. To a certain degree, yes, but I would say that there is, if I oversimplify somewhat, that there are layers to the realities we live in a certain sense, and there is a very deep layer in which we are attuned to basically everything that is alive, because in a certain sense, that non-dual logic that I was mentioning, but perhaps observed from a slightly different perspective, is essential for living beings in general. So in order for a living being to stay alive, it has to, in a certain sense, it has to somehow be separated from the milieu that surrounds it. But at the same time, this separation cannot be and must not be complete. It must not be full, because a complete separation would be basically death, or isolation would result in death. So there has to be a relationship again. So in the very act of aliveness, you have this difference in relating. So you differentiate, but still remain interrelated. And I think that this, let's say, the fundamental dynamics of aliveness is something that goes very, very deep. And it is as living beings that we are able to penetrate also very deeply by into other living beings, and into our and in our understanding of other beings, with the help of, say, practices such as cultivating compassion. Where we meet, I would say, is precisely in we meet in our ability to take up the sometimes they say you have to put yourself in the other person's shoes, and in a certain sense that makes sense, but it's more like you have to be able to take up the position of the other in order to see what is meaningful for that person. So although you are unable to maybe see all the specifics of the world that person lives in, there are certain meaningful structures that you both share, precisely by, first of all, being alive, secondly, being human beings, and thirdly, by living in cultures that are more or less in sync. And being able to somehow broaden this domain or sphere of compassion, or of being able to enter into the being of the other, is something that is extremely valuable, and something that I think can be cultivated via practices such as those that have developed in both Buddhist and certain other traditions.
So thank you so much, Sebastian, for taking the time to be with us tonight and sharing your insights. And I feel like I've learned a lot about phenomenology and how you're integrating it into your own life and your own practice. And it helps us also to understand what we're teaching here about the mind and transforming our afflictions. So it's very precious. And like you say, I hope this dialogue continues. I hope we have many chances to, I hope we can invite you here to Plum Village one day when we open up again, and we can have a chance to continue to develop this understanding of consciousness, the mind, and our lived experience. So thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. And I don't know if this was mentioned already, but maybe it could be pointed out that we had a second dialogue after the first one, and that we covered some of the topics that were really, really interesting. And we basically all agreed that the second part was better than the first one.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, so please, we will upload tonight the second part of the discussion. The second part is much more personal. I think both Sebastian and I, we kind of got into the real grit of our own experience and how we experience transformation in our path. So yeah, I definitely highly recommend. Thank you, Sebastian.
thank you again for having me.